big issue that we have with conspiracy theory folks is that they sort of conflate things that don't really go together. So they conflate cloud seeding with hurricane modification.
Or chemtrails.
That too.
Was Hurricane Helene's path just the result of natural processes, or was it manipulated?
Now, every time that there's a major weather event, it could be fires in Hawaii, or a superstorm on the coast, or tornadoes in Oklahoma, the internet goes ballistic with ideas that the government is controlling the weather.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is now saying the federal government is literally controlling the weather. It's beyond ridiculous.
Which at first sounds nuts, and a lot of it is, but weather modification itself is not nuts.
There's a new sense of possibility. Perhaps we are approaching an era where weather modification will not just be an interesting laboratory experiment.
In fact, there are companies actively developing technologies, from cloud seeding to fix droughts.
Flares are shooting millions of silver iodide and calcium chloride particles into the cloud.
To scientists who want to reduce global warming by injecting reflective particles into the atmosphere.
Geoengineering in the atmosphere, such as injecting sulfur-based particles high in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight.
There are just enough kernels of truth in many of these theories to give credence to one of the most controversial ideas out there today, man-made manipulation of the weather.
The best way to debunk a conspiracy is asking follow-up questions.
Now, weather modification is a large and complicated topic with a history that stretches back over a century. And like a lot of issues we cover on this show, it has recently become a polarizing topic because the facts seem to change based on who you're talking to. So today we're going to talk to three different people with three distinctly different points of view. One is a proponent that governments or unknown parties are actively controlling the weather. Another is a Harvard-educated meteorologist who believes that is patently false. And a third is an entrepreneur who's testified in front of state governments because he believes misinformation is leading to bans on potentially beneficial technology. We'll begin with the creator of countless viral videos that allege to track geoengineering, Dane Wigington. All right, here we go. Dane Wigington. I'm just going to get into your bona fides here. You have a background in solar energy, former employee at Bechtel, last 20 years of your life devoted to research on this. Now, I've done a little bit of reporting on geoengineering.
No technologies come without the potential for misuse. That is, some country tries to make more rain in one place and that makes it worse for somebody else. That's a realistic fear.
Obviously, you've done a lot more. You've done 20 years of this. But let's go back and do a primer, because there's a lot of things where people believe in something, but they don't know the givens. They don't know where it comes from. They don't know the definition. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories around stuff. So what is the textbook definition of geoengineering?
There's a number of terms that refer to these processes: solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud albedo enhancement. All of this refers to dispersing light scattering particles into the atmosphere in the stated attempt to deflect some of the sun's incoming thermal energy to slow down the warming of the planet. There are processes of climate engineering that most, even who think they're aware of this subject, are not aware of. Chemical ice nucleation, cloud seeding creates a surface cool down, a chemical cool down, and these processes were openly announced, for example, in China. If listeners search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm, they'll find Popular Science covered it, The Guardian, MSNBC, CNN, routinely creating a frozen precipitation event out of what should have been a liquid precipitation event.
So let's get into that, the history of this stuff. So we've got 1947, Project Cirrus, which scientists first attempt to modify a hurricane.
We will learn to put the finger on the trigger that releases climatic change, that changes the patterns of storms.
1962, Project Skywalker, cloud seeding. 62 to 83, Project Storm Fury, a series of hurricane modification experiments. Operation Popeye, probably the most well-known, was rainfall during Vietnam to extend monsoon. The DoD said was successful. So maybe you could give us a couple of, well-documented, projects that sort of set up the history of it, and then we'll get into what the hell's going on today.
I think you just did. And if we look at one other example, in the case of Iran, we had the leader of that country on the floor of the UN stating emphatically that NATO was cutting off the precipitation to their country.
Two cases that come to mind more recently. One is the recent floods in Dubai and Abu Dhabi.
The land of sand has become a world of water,
where they openly admit to doing cloud seeding and weather manipulation. And then all of a sudden in the middle of the desert.
Thunderstorms brought the most extreme rainfall on record, and there were reports of several deaths.
If I could elaborate on that, they admitted to it before they denied it. And so they initially admitted to it, and then they tried to walk it back as hard as they could.
Most people had initially blamed the excessive rainfall on the process of cloud seeding. But scientists say that this was not the actual reason. Rather, it's the climate change that caused an extreme weather system to develop over the region.
Also, they have, I believe, an office of climate engineering. They have, that the government pays for.
They do.
Yeah. So the other one, speaking of Iran not having rain, which sounds a bit crazy, but China was doing experiments with rainfall within China.
Firing rockets into the clouds and hoping for rain. These meteorology workers in China's Hubei province are participating in a 3-month project.
That led to a drought in India, and then India went to the UN and said, hey, hold on a second, we're not getting any rain. China's stealing our rain. So there are lots of precedents. There's been a long history of manipulation of the weather by government, supranational entities, etc. Is that safe to say, right?
Very.
Okay. So right now, there's a lot of speculation, as I'm sure you're aware more than most, about the latest back-to-back hurricanes in Florida and, how they came out of, seemingly nowhere. The President of the United States saying, oh, sure, haha, we can control the weather.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, a congresswoman of Georgia, is now saying the federal government is literally controlling the weather. We're controlling the weather. It's beyond ridiculous. It's got to stop.
Maybe you could sort of give us what the basis of these theories are.
What we stand on at geoengineeringwatch.org is what we can validate, what we can prove. So in regard to the spawning of a storm, we can't prove that. And certainly the oceans are scaldingly hot, fully logical that they would create cyclonic rotations. We would expect that. But when we have installations like HAARP in Alaska, and that's only one example of an ionosphere heater that we know have specific effects on the atmosphere that can, in the case of HAARP, transmit 3.6 million watts of power into the electrically charged ionosphere, heating it to extraordinarily high temperatures, causing the atmosphere to expand up and down, and even all the way back to the patent holder, Bernard Eastland, that fully acknowledged the ability of these installations to manipulate atmospheric pressure zones. So in theory, it's certainly logical to conclude that the climate engineers could create the conditions that are most conducive to spawn a storm.
I wanted to get into, because you also referenced it, HAARP, which is the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. A lot of people reference HAARP, and you referenced it yourself. Maybe just explain for the audience what HAARP is.
Yeah, I hope the audience takes the time to look this up, because this is even the images of this facility, which we're told is a benign research facility. And we would argue it's anything but benign. We would argue HAARP is a very covert weapon of mass destruction. And if we look at what this installation can likely do, let's backtrack to, Shane, you remember the extreme aurora event from about 3+ months ago?
Yes.
So is it just a coincidence that 10 days prior to that event, the HAARP installation issued warnings for the FAA for all air traffic to stay out of their airspace during the exact window when this aurora event took place? Is that just a coincidence?
So HAARP is still functioning?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The notion that happened in, I think, 2016, that they were going to shut it down and bulldoze it, tear it down. And at geoengineeringwatch.org, we stated not going to happen. This is all a big sleight of hand, smoke and mirrors. That installation isn't going anywhere, and it didn't. It's still operational now.
Still operational.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, and that's only one installation. There are other designs for ionosphere heaters in many other locations.
And what would it do? What would it do?
It transmits 3.6 million watts of power into the electrically charged ionosphere, it creates an electrical chain reaction. So even with that minimal input, and 3.6 million watts of power may sound like a lot, but atmospherically speaking, it's not. But when you cause this electrical chain reaction, it becomes a lot. And so the temperatures that HAARP can heat the ionosphere to are extraordinarily high over vast areas, 400 and 500 square miles.
And what's its stated purpose? What does the government say it's supposed to be doing?
To study the aurora borealis
Phenomenon.
Phenomenon, yes, thank you. Raytheon ended up with a patent for that installation.
So hold on, Raytheon has a patent for HAARP?
I think they bought the patent from the original patent holders.
At Raytheon's advanced technology business, breakthroughs are just the beginning. It's your mission that's the true catalyst, fueling the future of defense. We are Raytheon Advanced Technology.
So in theory, it's certainly logical to conclude that climate engineers could create the conditions that are most conducive to spawn a storm. Now, in regard to hurricane suppression, if we go back to actually Project Cirrus, even the very minimal amount of input, because this argument was made over and over, Shane, that the hurricane has so much energy, there's no way you could inflict enough input to alter whatever its behavior was. And that simply doesn't stand up to science, because Project Cirrus, with I believe less than 100 pounds of materials distributed into that storm, it was believed at the time that it changed the course of that storm, so much so that there was litigation pending, and then they walked back their conclusions of what actually happened in that case, and they seemed to want to go underground then after that. So if that was indeed possible with such a minimal input, what can aircraft do now when a KC-135 can carry 100 tons of material? And let's add the frequency transmissions, which are patented processes of being able to manipulate air masses. All of this a part of the equation.
So just to go back, Project Cirrus, 1947, scientists first attempt to modify a hurricane specifically by flying into a cyclone and dropping dry ice. And so now, obviously, we're much more sophisticated. We have the ability to drop a lot more stuff. So if that was successful, theoretically, it's possible that we could go in, modify hurricanes. Now, why? Why would we do that? What's the motive, if you will?
First, I would give a little context in this, and that we don't try to speculate on the agendas and objectives, because we can't know that. I know a lot of people are doing exactly that, but we don't enter that fray. When we know the U.S. military, according to the Washington Post, as far back as 1977, the U.S. military had conducted no less than 239 open-air biological experiments on innocent, unknowing U.S. civilians. Why would they do that? And in regard to being able to manipulate the weather, again, I would refer to and you've probably seen this, Shane, that the 1962 recording of Lyndon Johnson, former U.S. president, ranting like a lunatic, stating on the record, "We had the power to control the world's cloud layer then," and quote, "He who controls the weather controls the world."
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
So this is, we would argue, the crown jewel covert weapon of the controllers, in that they can bring populations to their knees without those populations ever even knowing they're under assault.
So let's get into the 1,000-pound elephant in the room. Chemtrails obviously have been at the forefront of this topic for a long time. Are they real? Are they not real? If they are, what are they? Is it some form of geoengineering? That would be a pretty big conspiracy theory to keep through NDAs. What are your thoughts on chemtrails?
Well, first, we avoid that term.
Okay.
It's a non-science term. We avoid it at Geoengineering Watch like the plague. We stick to the climate science terms: stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud albedo enhancement. When we have film footage of these aircraft at altitude, nozzles visible, turning dispersions on and off, from our perspective, that's the end of the legitimate debate. This is a spray dispersion, period. So again, what geoengineeringwatch.org has done to verify this is not just, quote, jet exhaust, and again, it's coming out of a nozzle. We have up-close photographs of the retrofit nozzles on aircraft. So we're not speculating here. And this should occur to most people that still have a functional sense of reason. You can't have grid patterns in the sky one day with all sorts of stripes over regions that there's no commercial air traffic and nothing the next with similar atmospheric patterns. Again, common sense should kick in. We have the entire global climate science community stating emphatically that we should put jets in the air to spray toxic particles to blot out the sun, and yet they tell us it's only a proposal. And again, would we think the government would ask our permission to do this? Do they ask our permission to detonate 2,400 nuclear bombs all over the globe? Did anybody ask anybody's permission on that? They just did it because they can, because no one will stop them.
So again, I ask, was Hurricane Helene's path and behavior just an act of nature, or was it engineered?
Now, what we just heard are some of the central ideas that evolved from historically accurate examples of weather modification that morphed into now widespread allegations about man-made droughts, weather-controlling weaponized scientific facilities, and of course, an enduring global meme about the existence of chemtrails. Now, Dean's videos have tens of millions of cumulative views, so that there's certainly an appetite for them. But to learn the scientific counterpoint to Dean's findings,
A nasty tornado and big hail to about golf ball size moving into Hawley, Texas. Look at that thing.
we spoke to Harvard-educated meteorologist and storm chaser, Matthew Capucci. Matthew Capucci, I'm just going to get this and you tell me if I'm wrong or if I'm right with any of this stuff. Atmospheric scientist, meteorologist, and storm chaser.
Yes.
Senior meteorologist at My Radar, host of the Capital Weather Gang, in quotes, podcast. Also commonly featured as a print, not commonly, but regularly. How about that? That's a better word.
I like that.
Writer for Washington Post and on air for NPR.
Yep.
Here's my fun fact, the one that I like the best, and so I put it in for myself. The only person to ever graduate from Harvard with an atmospheric sciences degree. Is that true?
Yeah, I was a little Department of One. I did what was called a special concentration, which meant it was just me and some of my little one-on-one tutorials. The department Christmas parties were kind of lonely, but it was worth it.
So there's a lot I want to get to, and I don't even know where to begin because there's so much, but you just did it for me. Storm chasing, you're a storm chaser.
Yeah, so hurricanes and tornadoes. Tornadoes are sort of my bread and butter. Every May, so May is just a crazy busy month for tornadoes. You have the warmth of springtime clashing against the cold of winter kind of pent up in the Rockies. You have the jet stream, so a river of really fierce winds sweeping overhead, and it all kind of overlaps for like 4 or 5 weeks over Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and you just get round after round of spinning thunderstorms that produce tornadoes. And so weeks in advance, I'll start driving out there. I'll be there for the entirety of May, intercepting tornadoes at close range. You know, close enough to a tornado to have grass and insulation and debris hitting me. I've lost 6 windshields and softball-sized hail, and it's the weirdest job you can possibly imagine. But to bring viewers that close to tornadoes, to hurricanes, to all that stuff that we only hear about in the media or see online, it's amazing to use that as a classroom for people.
Mr. Harvard, Matthew Capucci, can you please explain the difference between a tornado and a hurricane?
Yeah, so tornadoes like that little tiny whirl of wind, and they might be, you know, a couple feet wide. They might be 2.5.
There's movies about storm chasing a tornado.
Twisters,
there we go. And wasn't there a recent one? There was a remake.
So the original was Twister, and they just tacked on an S, so it's Twisters, the new one. But
and you love that movie.
I love it. I love it too because the nerds are presented as like cool nerds, whereas in other movies,
you're a cool nerd.
I like to think so.
And hurricane?
Hurricane is 500,000 miles wide. Yeah, they're big. They're the ones that form the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean and kind of move north and oftentimes impact Florida or the Gulf Coast. So chasing a hurricane is vastly different because I have to plan for days of being in a disaster area. Yeah. Because hurricanes are so big that they push ocean water ashore, sometimes a 20-foot storm surge or more.
Right.
You have fierce winds that might rival the wind speeds of tornadoes, causing damage, destruction to structures. And there's no real good place to position.
Have you been chasing any hurricanes this hurricane season?
Yeah, we had 5 landfalls in the U.S. I chased 4 of them. There was for Helene and for Milton and Francine down in Louisiana and Florida for the last 2. And so it's been a really busy season.
Why?
So a couple different reasons. We have a burgeoning La Nina, which favors cooler waters in the eastern tropical Pacific. And you're probably saying, who cares about the Pacific? We're talking the Atlantic here.
Sure.
Well, the Pacific, if we cool the waters, the air above it cools and starts to sink.
Right.
So you get sinking in the Pacific, the air elsewhere has to rise, so it rises over the Atlantic and makes it easier for storms to form.
Right.
Moreover, we had water temperatures running 2-3 degrees above average, which doesn't sound like that much, but that's an incredible amount of heat energy that hurricanes can extract.
Yeah. And is that why we're seeing more and more of them, because of the warming of the oceans, global warming, etc.?
So interestingly, it's actually the opposite. We're seeing, thanks to climate change, fewer storms, but those we get tend to be more intense.
Fiercer.
But we think that as the upper atmosphere warms, we'll see fewer hurricanes, but those that form will be markedly more intense. So they'll have higher winds, they'll be certainly wetter, and they might move a little more slowly too, and be more prone to rapid intensification.
Right.
So that's not really good news for the future. The weaker ones might not form as easily, but the stronger ones will have kind of a higher ceiling.
Now, I didn't want to start this early, but I'm going to. There's a lot of people online
Oh, yes.
who are talking about the increased ferocity of the storms.
Yep.
And also saying like the government can affect weather, the government, that we have technology, cloud seeding, what have you. So I want to sort of start at the beginning.
Yep.
Project Cirrus in 1947. So,
Yep.
so let's just go
Yeah,
chronologically.
so Project Cirrus was back in the 1940s. In 1947, they said, hey, what if we could steer the path of hurricanes?
Yes.
And so they basically went out and flew into the storm and dumped a bunch of dry ice, and they thought maybe that could change the path of the storm.
They thought it worked.
Well, they did briefly, and then the hurricane went the wrong way, and they realized, uh-oh, this didn't work.
So
It hit
sorry,
Savannah,
why
Georgia.
would dry ice move anything?
Well, realistically, it wouldn't. You'd need a ton of it. You know, a single hurricane churns through 200 times more energy than the entirety of humanity produces. And so the idea that we can meaningfully affect the weather or meaningfully affect a hurricane, whether it be manipulating it, creating it, steering it, is apocryphal. But back then, we didn't really know that. And so they said, hey...
So we dumped some dry ice.
Yeah, they said, you know, let's dump some dry ice, see if we can cool the atmosphere, see if we can kind of knock it off kilter, get it to move. And it didn't do what they wanted, and they kind of ruled that theory out. So fast forward later on to Project Storm Fury in the 1960s, 1970s, so between 62 and 83.
62 and 83.
Yeah.
See, I got it, you got it. We have dueling notes.
I love it. So back then they said, you know, a hurricane is most ferocious at its core.
Yeah.
You have something called the eye wall, that innermost ring of winds that surrounds the calm eye. And this innermost ring of winds might only be, say, 10 miles wide. In the case of Milton recently, 3 miles wide. So you're packing a ton of fury into a really small area. So they said, what if we weaken the inner part of the hurricane so it kind of spreads out and weakens a little bit? So their goal was to do that by disrupting the eye wall. And they said, what if we fly into the storm and dump silver iodide, little teeny particulates, to get water and supercooled water droplets to nucleate on, to kind of coalesce on, form precipitation, form whatever, and kind of precipitate out and essentially weaken the eye wall.
And why would we want to do this?
Because if you weaken the eye wall, you weaken that inner ring of winds, the rest of the storm's kind of knocked off kilter.
Got it.
But spreads out and weakens.
So we want to be able to weaken hurricanes.
Yeah, ideally, because they're so costly, they're so destructive. I mean, I'm sure if we could hurt hurricanes, we would. Why wouldn't we? But we just don't have that technology.
So if it's coming towards Florida,
yeah,
Swiss Re is going, oh, we're going to have $42 billion worth of damage. Let's put some silver iodine in there and knock it out.
And in theory, it sounds great. So back in 1963, Hurricane Beulah, big nasty hurricane, is forming in the Gulf. They fly in, they dump their silver iodide, and suddenly the innermost ring of winds weakens by 20%. And they say, wow, we did it.
We've done it.
And you know what happened?
No.
Right after, a new ring of winds formed around it
Right.
and contracted towards the middle.
Right.
And they thought, maybe something's up. So they tried it a couple more times. They kept noticing that at some point, that inner ring of winds would weaken and a new one would form around it, a new eye wall. And by the 70s, we realized that would happen anyway. It was something called an eye wall replacement cycle. Every day or two, in a hurricane, you get kind of the inner ring of winds to weaken, and a new one forms. It's like a snake shedding its skin. It sheds its eye wall, and then a new one kind of envelops it and sort of tightens. And the tighter that new one gets, the stronger the hurricane will be.
So they thought it worked, but it was just part of the natural process.
Yeah, and by the late 70s, they said, you know what? This isn't really working. Let's try researching hurricanes instead.
Yeah, Popeye.
Yes. So Popeye is something completely different.
Yeah.
You know, people, one big issue that we have with conspiracy theory folks is that they sort of conflate things that don't really go together.
Right.
So they conflate cloud seeding with hurricane modification.
Or cloud seeding with chemtrails.
That too. Now, we can seed a cloud, but think about the scale of a cloud versus the scale of a hurricane. You have a hurricane which expends the energy of 10,000 nuclear bombs, or a little fluffy cumulus cloud. Now, the idea of cloud seeding is that we're taking moisture that's already up there and just getting that moisture to fall. The goal of cloud seeding is to get those droplets to coalesce onto something, to put a little teeny particulate up there, like silver iodide, get them to coalesce and fall. So, like in Dubai, they do that, and it works a little bit. They can't create moisture.
They had floods recently because of that, right?
No, so they had floods, but that was an entirely different idea. So that's kind of the scale argument we're getting at. The floods were caused by something called a mesoscale convective complex, a big flare-up of thunderstorms that stalled and parked over the area, courtesy of antecedent weather conditions. What Dubai does is say, hey, we don't get enough rain. We need the rain for our infrastructure. There's some moisture up there, but it's not falling. Let's try to get this cloud to drop its moisture. And they fly up there. They go through the cloud, they sprinkle some silver iodide, and you get a little bit more moisture to fall. You get a little bit more rain. You're not able to create storm systems.
What happens to the silver iodide?
It's infinitesimally small.
Wow.
It's, all raindrops form around something.
Right.
To get rain to fall, it has to kind of gather on something, whether that be a pollen particle, whether that be dust in the atmosphere, whether that be a salt aerosol, anything like that. So the purpose of the silver iodide, they're incredibly small, microscopic.
Would they be like, you're ingesting them then?
That would be more a question for an atmospheric chemist. I can say that the scale that they're doing it at is just not enough.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's another question.
But Popeye you asked about.
Yes, Vietnam.
So Popeye, between like 67 and I think 72, they said, hey, what if we could cloud seed and get more thunderstorms in Vietnam to dump moisture on the outsides of monsoon season? Their goal was to essentially fly the airplanes up there, sprinkle some stuff, and make more rainfall on kind of the edges of monsoon season. So a few weeks beforehand, a few weeks after, because if you can interrupt the enemy's infrastructure, if you can cause low water passings to be impassable, if you can get roads washed out. So that was their goal. There wasn't really a good sort of follow-up after to see how well it worked. Theoretically, it can work. Theoretically, it does work. It's been put into practice in Dubai, not to the scale that a lot of conspiracy theorists think. And the idea of doing that to a cumulus cloud, a little fluffy cloud, or even a single downpour versus doing it in scale to a hurricane, just two completely different things.
When you say people conflate, I find that interesting because so people are saying, you're saying like on a very small scale, we did some modification experiments during Vietnam.
So we can essentially get water that's already up there on a small scale to come down.
It's in the cloud.
Exactly. We can get that to come down and we can cause a little bit of precipitation. But on the scale of a hurricane, for starters, we know there's not an issue with water up there that's not coming down. All the water in a hurricane, for the most part, comes down and falls out. We don't have the means to steer a hurricane. The flow that affects a hurricane is so vast that nothing we could do would meaningfully manipulate, change it, etc. One of my favorite conspiracies, somebody wrote into me and said, the government's definitely controlling it. Hurricanes only hit red states. And I said, let's think about that. You're telling me that you're surprised that more hurricanes hit Florida than Connecticut. You don't have to be a meteorologist to see why more hurricanes will hit Florida than Connecticut.
Or, Oklahoma, Texas, kind of coming up from the Gulf.
Right.
Now, that's a great segue. So, we're talking about like a cloud and putting some, some stuff into it.
Yeah.
So the water,
precipitates,
and so it comes down a little bit.
Yeah.
Fine. Hurricanes are like 10 atomic bombs.
10,000.
10,000.
Yeah. So 200 times more energy than all of mankind can produce.
So when you talk about that, you're like, okay, doesn't make a ton of sense. Now, why is it, so to go back to your people saying, of course, and it only goes to the red states, not only do they believe it's happening, and they believe we have the technology to do it, they believe that you can pinpoint it, and also they bring up things like, and I'm going to check my notes, you check your notes, everybody check their notes. They talk about Operation Popeye, but then And we've talked a little bit about this.
I know where you're going to go with this. HAARP?
HAARP. What is HAARP?
So HAARP, it's called the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. It researches the ionosphere, so about 30 to 600 miles above the ground. Way high up there, the upper part of the atmosphere. It's where you have a lot of free electrons. It's where radio waves propagate. Oftentimes the aurora borealis is up there. So essentially it's like a big radio transmitter in Alaska that sends up signals way up there and researches how they behave. They've been doing that for years.
Why?
It will continue. It's useful for scientists to understand the upper atmosphere in terms of the electric structure of the upper atmosphere for things like space weather, for things like the northern lights, even signal propagation. But I don't know how the public or how these conspiracy theorists became fixated on this one little thing, which is so ironic because it's research on the ionosphere. Weather doesn't happen up there. Weather happens in the troposphere and the stratosphere within pretty much the bottom 10 to 15 miles of the atmosphere. Just vastly different layers. Radio signals don't have the ability to affect the weather. That's like saying, oh, I turned on my TV today. My clicker, my TV remote, made a thunderstorm. It's just so, I don't want to use the word asinine, but it really is.
So why do people believe that it's controlling the weather then?
Because people realistically don't know what they don't know. I could very easily, and anyone could very easily, throw together some sciencey sounding words and string them all together and convince the public of anything. The public these days has very minimal scientific literacy, and that's not meant as an insult, it's meant as true. It's way easier to believe entertaining conspiracy theories than invest the time and energy into understanding something.
Is HAARP like a secret thing, or they release their data? Like, why would people fixate on that? Sorry. And NOAA, or is it NOAA?
Either. Yeah, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration.
Yeah. So why do people focus on NOAA and HAARP?
Because they don't know enough. They don't care to know enough.
But can you go there? Like, is it a secret? Like, you can't go on the base, or like, can you just go there and say, I'd like to go see what you guys are doing?
You can read all the research. You can read anything you want. It's all publicly available data. The issue is that the public doesn't understand it. It'd be like if I put out, cyclogenesis research or complex meteorological research. No one's going to read it because they can't understand it. It's research designed for folks in the field.
Now, let's go into NOAA.
Yep.
What do they do?
They're the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So in the Department of Commerce, we have NOAA. They oversee all oceans research, oceans forecasting, the National Weather Service. They're the folks who are the ones who issue tornado warnings, issue flash flood warnings. Anytime your phone goes off with a dire weather alert, that's the National Weather Service. They're staffed 24/7. They have, I think, like 122 offices across the country that are nonstop watching the weather. And we've had them since really the 1940s and 1950s. They evolved out of sort of military weather forecasters that eventually morphed into the Weather Bureau that became sort of a public government-funded entity, and nowadays serves the public for the protection of life and property.
And did they do a good job?
It would depend on what metric you're asking about.
I mean, are they're trustworthy?
Oh, very much so. I mean, they're all highly degreed meteorologists, very talented folks, and no one's going to weather to get rich. If I wanted to get rich with my degree, I'd be on Wall Street. Right. But I'm not. I'm a weather guy who shares information about weather and educates the public. Nobody's going into it to get rich. They're going into it because they're passionate about educating, informing people, and keeping folks safe. And ultimately, if you live in Tornado Alley, if you live in a hurricane-prone area, you want those warnings.
It seems to be more of a modern phenomenon that we're saying that this is a conspiracy run by the government. Now, that's an interesting thing, and I've never thought about that. But if I, wanted to make money, and then I wouldn't do the weather. But I took that one step further. If it was possible to manipulate the weather, the way then you could be a trillionaire, because you'd be like, I can control hurricanes.
Well, and it's like the number of comments I get, the number of people who are emailing me, telling me I'm hiding whatever this is, that we can really control the weather.
Yeah.
I think to myself, why would I go on TV in the morning and tell you what the weather is going to do if I was trying to hide what the weather is doing?
When you see these things, when you're berated by them, all the time, you start to go, well, I guess it makes sense logically. And so, not that controlling the weather makes sense, but you just see it so often, and it's such like, So the reason why I brought up Dubai is there's these weird floods and the airport didn't work, whatever. And they're like, well, they have an office of cloud seeding, whatever it's called. And they say, yeah, we do manipulate the weather. And so people that was an assumption that everybody that was their weather manipulation. You're like, no, it was a storm.
They make jumps that Evel Knievel couldn't make, though, from, natural occurrence to it must be this. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing these days is that, like you said, if we're seeing something so often on social media, then it becomes subliminally true. Yeah. But the issue is that, on social media, the loudest voices aren't always the ones that should have the biggest microphone.
Sure.
The other issue, too, is that social media these days is monetized. So whether it be X paying folks for engagement, or TikTok, or even Facebook pays for engagement now, I could very easily put out these inane conspiracies that are so damn entertaining that they take off like wildfire. If I really wanted to, I could hype up any fake storm that doesn't exist yet and use my extant platform to get millions and millions of views and take home thousands of dollars. And there are folks out there who are subverting public intelligence and education in an effort to essentially
make money.
And it's easy to do.
Right, make money, drive traffic.
Yeah.
It's a lot less sexy for us to say it's just the weather. Now, we can say the weather is changing, or it's morphing, or it's getting worse, or global warming is, leading to a release of heat from the Pacific, which, but so you're unequivocal. We're not manipulating the weather.
Correct.
We don't manipulate it for a political motive.
Correct.
Now, sorry,
Sure.
I just want to get into the last one because this is maybe the biggest one. And I know it's not necessarily your area of expertise, but I want to get into it anyway. Weather manipulation is sort of modern. The hurricanes that are happening is, and saying it's a political party. So they politicize the weather. Look, they politicized elections, they politicized COVID, they politicize science, they politicize global warming, politicize a lot of things. Both sides are guilty of propaganda.
100%.
I kind of feel that weather entered sort of mainstream media in like 2019 with Hurricane Dorian.
Yeah, so that was around the time of Sharpiegate, which was one of the weirdest events I've ever worked. So I had just started full-time at the Washington Post, and we had this Category 5 hurricane over the Bahamas. It was a big deal. It was like 90 miles away from hitting Florida, and it never did. But it rode up the coast, and sideswiped parts of the Carolinas, gave them a tornado outbreak. But as it was paralleling Georgia and the Carolinas offshore, at the time, President Trump tweeted something to the effect of like, the Carolinas, watch out, we're going to have all resources ready for there, and coastal Georgia and Alabama. And, one of these things is not like the other. Alabama's like here, and the southeast coast is over here.
Yeah.
Alabama was getting plenty of sunshine that day.
Right.
Nothing was going on weather-wise. But unfortunately, a lot of people in Alabama saw that tweet.
It was a gaffe.
Yeah, it was a goof.
Yeah.
Saw that tweet. Panic called the National Weather Service in Birmingham. So a bunch of meteorologists like me are sitting there one day. Their phones start ringing off the hook, and they're like, what the heck? We're getting hundreds of calls about a hurricane, which is nowhere near us. So they put out a tweet saying there is no hurricane threat whatsoever for Alabama. We repeat, no hurricane threat. They didn't know at the time that the president had tweeted about Alabama.
Right.
Trump saw that, took that as a personal slight that they were correcting him, held a press conference where he had the hurricane forecast from the National Hurricane Center, and he drew with Sharpie the hurricane potentially looping back into Alabama. So it was an old map he had come up with and drew an extension of it.
And you see it was going to hit not only Florida, but Georgia. It could have, was going toward the Gulf. That was what was originally projected. And it took a right turn.
Never in a million years did I think a sitting president would be manipulating a hurricane map, which, by the way, is actually illegal. There's an old law in the books where you cannot...
And sorry, was this proven that he sort of...
Oh, yeah, like there's this extra random little line that he's drawing there. That, yeah, so anyway, at the time I was working the Washington Post and we broke the story and went home for the weekend. That was that. My bosses sort of took care of coverage over the weekend, and I came back on Monday morning and my inbox was inundated with some strongly worded emails. I made a little collage after. My friends went out and kind of sat there for happy hour after work reading these. But it seems like that was the point when weather became political, and we never wanted it to be political. And the worst part was that it was later proven that Trump essentially forced the Department of Commerce and the head of NOAA to put out a statement bashing the local National Weather Service that issued the correct forecast, saying that Alabama wouldn't be hit. And it's just sad to see these days that even weather, which is the least political thing out there, it's freaking water vapor and sunshine. That's literally what it is somehow becoming that politicized.
Pre-politicizing the weather, and so now so much so that it's almost a given, is chemtrails, and the fact that there have been some government agencies saying, well, we are doing some geoengineering, and we are putting particulate, like aluminum,
And that's essentially trying to put little particles up there that cut back on how much sunlight comes in.
There you go.
And
what's that called?
So that's just kind of solar geoengineering in general. Theoretically, it sounds great. But it hasn't been done at scale.
Right.
So they're testing it to see if it could curb our increasing temperatures thanks to climate change. It's been the subject of research for decades. There's not really a viable solution, and we also know that if we were to do something like that, that could potentially have sort of a ripple effect in the atmosphere and how the atmosphere behaves. And so there have been no efforts to do that at scale. Now, it's true, airplanes that fly overhead, any single one of them, if they pass through a layer of moisture, can produce a contrail, so just water behind the plane. If you've ever flown on an airplane, you look out the window, you see contrails forming behind you. So contrails shouldn't be a conspiracy.
So this is what I'm saying. So because people are saying we've done geoengineering, that they're conflating two things, and they're saying, okay, we've done geoengineering testing to try to see if, like, on a small scale, we can put basically little tiny mirrors to send radiation back into space. But the chemtrail thing, which is now taken as a given because there's been these...
it's nuts.
And so what would you say to those conspiracy theorists?
Get on a damn airplane and look out the window. I mean,
they'll just say, you can see where it turns on and where it turns off. And
you really think you're on a Delta flight going from, Los Angeles to Philly, and you think that they have extra stuff in the bottom of the plane that's shooting out the side. It's apocryphal. The best way to debunk a conspiracy is asking follow-up questions. For the folks who thinks that, they are spraying something, who is they? What are they spraying? What is the purpose? How has it purportedly affected you?
It's another thing that just struck me, which probably you're going to laugh at me for because it's so simplistic, but China, they admit to manipulating the weather.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you know about that?
I mean, I never really know how much to trust from the Chinese government, obviously. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they've launched attempts to manipulate the weather on the small scale that we discussed was possible, but there's no evidence to support that they can, of course, manipulate large-scale weather systems that many people are, claiming they can.
Right. Matthew Capucci, Storm Chaser, cool nerd.
Thank you.
And by the way, calmer downer of fears.
I try.
And just great to talk to you. Great to get like a voice of reason.
Thank you.
And say, hey, the more scientists actually should be out there doing what they can to dispel fears. I think if there were more people like you, we would trust science more and social media less. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Tennessee lawmakers are trying to ban the intentional release of chemicals into the air based on a conspiracy theory.
Now, speaking of chemtrails, as the debate between established science and conspiracy theory continues, there's now legislation being proposed across the country to ban any attempts to modify our atmosphere.
Part of what I'm concerned about in Bill 2063 is that it would prevent Tennessee from stewarding creation with all the tools it has available.
So we spoke to entrepreneur Augustus Dorico about the future of weather modification. Augustus Dorico, Bango, thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about you for a little bit, even though you're in front of me. CEO and founder of Rainmaker, a cloud seeding geoengineering startup that aims to create water abundance in the United States. You also previously were the co-founder of Terra Seco. First of all, why did you become interested in water?
Yeah, serendipity. I stumbled into it. I didn't plan on being an entrepreneur at all, but when the pandemic happened, I was going to school at Berkeley for physics, moved down to Texas just because it was simpler to live there at the time. I didn't know anybody there, so I became a personal trainer on the weekends, and I liked to work out, wanted to hang out with people, and I met the biggest water well driller in DFW. And so he told me all about his industry, about drilling, about water consumption, and eventually that he was starting a consultancy to handle the regulatory compliance for groundwater users like farms. And he was sending a guy out in a truck to read an analog flow meter, fill out a report by hand, submit it. And I was like, why don't you automate that? And so we ended up building a software company called Terraseco that automated the reporting for these groundwater users. And I asked him, in the process of starting this, like, why even is there regulation around groundwater use? And it's because all the aquifers west of the Mississippi are fucked. Like in Phoenix, they're banning new housing development because there's not enough water there. In the Central Valley, the state plans for 500,000 acres to desertify within the next 8 years, et cetera, throughout the rest of the American West. And so the state's starting to come in and saying, if you pump this much, then we'll penalize you X dollars per gallon that you pump. And so that company, Terraseco, was just to manage the compliance. And then after working on that for like 3 years, I realized that the inconvenience of regulation is just a proximate problem. The ultimate problem is we just need more water. And you need more water not just on the coasts where you can do desal, but in Utah, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, all the interior states. So how do you make more water there? You've really got two options, right? Maybe three. One, you do like the Star Wars Tatooine, Luke Skywalker atmospheric water condensation thing. That's good, but if you suck too much water vapor out of the air, then you actually aridify the local plants. You increase the evaporation from the plants, kill them, so that doesn't work at scale. Option 2 is water recycling. That's good, we should do that. Option 3 that I found out about just through asking around and Googling, talking to scientists, was weather modification, cloud seeding. This tech, you said you looked into it in the past. It's been around for like 80 years.
Sure.
And so the huge question that I had was, if this has existed for so long, either there needs to be some critical breakthrough in it, or like it just doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
Because if it did work, it'd be everywhere. And what I found out was the reason why nobody had really scaled cloud seeding was attribution. Like, it was impossible to attribute precipitation to your intervention, meaning like, if I fly a drone up into a cloud and I sprinkle fairy dust and then it rains, that doesn't mean that we caused it to rain, right? Like, how do you differentiate between the natural and the anthropogenic precipitation? The thing that changed through like 2017 through 2021 is some scientists from the National Center of Atmospheric Research realized if you have super high-res radar and you fly in, say, a zigzag pattern or a spiral, something to that effect, then you can, if it's working, see the precipitation co-located with your flight track.
Oh, I see. So you do a zigzag, and they can say, oh, because of the zigzag, we can see that it doesn't rain in Z's, but now it does. So
exactly.
We can attribute.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah, and you can measure exactly how much water you put on the ground.
Okay, now let's get into the science. So how do you make it rain?
Yeah, so there's two different kinds of cloud seeding. There's glaciogenic and hygroscopic. Glaciogenic, glacier, right? It relies on freezing liquid in the cloud into heavy enough snowflakes so that they become heavy enough to precipitate. So you'll, with radar or other probes, measure how much water is in the cloud. If you have water that's around like 0 degrees Celsius or below, you can fly a drone up into it, spray this fairy dust that I told you about, silver iodide. That chemical, its crystal structure is almost identical to ice, so water freezes onto it very favorably, grows into those big heavy snowflakes, then precipitates either as snow or, if it's warm beneath the cloud, as rain.
Okay, so you seed it with silver iodide, and it rains.
Or snows.
Or snows. Okay, does it work?
Yeah, totally. So like I said, the experiments that I built my company on the basis of were one from the National Center of Atmospheric Research. They did a bunch of operations in Idaho, produced in imperial units like 300 million gallons per flight of precipitation, so tons of rain. And then Cloud Lab, which is a lab in Zurich, Switzerland, recapitulated this, and then we did the same in the United States. So right now, Rainmaker operates in California, Colorado, Utah, Oregon, and starting in January in the Middle East as well. I gave a testimony to the Tennessee General Assembly earlier this year because they were banning weather modification. We have 80 years of data on whether weather modification is safe, like whether small-scale weather modification is safe, cloud seeding. Solar
is it?
Huh?
Is it?
Overwhelmingly.
And what are the sort of environmental fallout, impacts or ramifications of seeding?
So there's 3 on the short term that matter and 1 on the longest term. On the short term, the question is like, is the chemical that we're using toxic, right? RFK is very concerned about it, for example.
Silver iodide.
Yeah. But the toxicity threshold for silver iodide is 10 times higher than aspirin. right? So like it's not, it's a negligibly toxic substance, and we're using tens of grams of it over hundreds of thousands of acres. So you end up with, over decades, like parts per trillion in the water. So with respect to the like bioaccumulation of the chemical, totally fine. And even still, Rainmaker's investigating and researching alternative chemicals that are even more safe. The second thing is, do you cause flooding, right? Like we saw what happened in Dubai. And whether you cause flooding or not is contingent on how sophisticated or how cautious your operational thresholds are. Like if that cloud's going to rain already, maybe you shouldn't seed it because then it'll flood the ground. Or if the reservoirs are full, don't do that. Then the third thing is, do you cause downwind droughts, right? Like if I seed a cloud in Nevada, is that going to take water from Utah? I think we need to do a lot more research into that one. It depends on the cloud from what we can tell so far. Some clouds are never naturally going to precipitate, and so seeding those in, say, Nevada, those clouds never would have precipitated in Utah anyway, so that's purely positive sum, but we need to do a lot more study into whether and which clouds are net zero. Then the fourth thing is, and this is maybe one of Rainmaker's most controversial takes, like we're a terraforming company. Like my magnum opus is extending the Great Plains through West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, into California, making all of that land green and arable. That will have climatological consequences. But provided that all the modeling is correct and there's no catastrophic consequences associated, I would rather have more life and a greener planet rather than like empty deserts that are useless for everybody.
Yeah. So you were mentioning all the states that you're in. What do you do? Who pays you, and how successful has it been?
Yeah. So the departments of natural resources, or the public works departments, or the departments.
So various like government agencies.
It's government. Yeah.
So the governments pay you money to seed the clouds.
Can confirm the government is deliberately modifying the weather.
Wow.
Yes. Yep.
We have a scoop
on the record.
I'm going to pretend to write something here.
Yep.
So the government is paying you to modify the weather.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, I can assure you that we are modifying the weather.
You heard it here first. Which is a great segue to my next questions, which you know where we're going. Okay, so governments are paying you. You're doing it at the behest of local governments, regional governments, whatever it is, and it's working?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they pay you money. What do? You send up a plane?
So we do two things right now, Rainmaker. One, we use drones.
Drones.
So the drones, way more cost effective than planes, way safer because you're not flying pilots into icing conditions.
Yeah.
And then we have these things called ground generators, which are essentially smokestacks that you put on the tops of mountains that emit a plume of these particles up into the clouds.
That's interesting because there's another form of geoengineering that mimics volcanoes or enhances volcanoes to try to cool down the planet.
Yeah, solar radiation management.
There
exactly.
you go. And there's another one, ship tracks.
See, but you said like before, we've done such a good job of modifying the weather and the climate thus far. Like, well, we're fucking it up unintentionally all the time.
Yeah.
Like, we might as well deliberately try to make it better, right?
Well, see, that's the whole thing. It's a great idea until it isn't. And, we fucked it up pretty bad. And we fucked it up pretty bad because a lot of people lied. The fossil fuel industry knew what they were doing and spent billions, and still do, to sow disinformation, misinformation, and questions. And the head of Exxon said, "Yeah, there's nothing to do with us. It's all sunspots." And you're like, "Yeah, there's nothing to see here."
There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with man. The climate has changed every year for millions of years. It has to do with sunspots. It has to do with the wobble of the earth.
When you look at geoengineering, it's basically we're grasping at straws, trying to come up with ways of cooling down the planet. What you're doing, as you say, is sort of terraforming, i.e. we're taking deserts and making them green, which is good for farming, which is good for population, which is good for all the things we need it for. But what are the unforeseen consequences? And has there been any sort of work done to say, okay, let's model out this thing and say, okay, we're going to do this? Like, what are the consequences?
Yeah, so I mean, for one, I'll say we're a long ways away from being able to turn, let's say, the Mojave green.
Right.
The first step in this, the first step in climate adaptation is just like getting stuff back to baseline. Like the Colorado River is at historically low flows. We're right now just trying to get that back to a historic average, right? And that's, yes, for farming and for all the cities that are dependent on it, but it's also for the ecosystems and the species that rely on that. Like the Colorado River Delta has been hammered in the last 30 years by how much we've drawn the river down. So first and foremost, just getting back to normalcy with respect to our water resources. That's the first priority, and that's going to take a while. After that is when we can start to think about like real terraforming projects, real climate adaptation at a unprecedented scale. With respect to what modeling has been done, what work has been done there, yeah, like Sahara dust actually, like the dust that's kicked up from the Sahara traverses the Atlantic. Very important cloud condensation nuclei in the Amazon. So like maybe you don't want to green the Sahara because that's part of what causes all the precipitation there. That's going to have to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But the thing is though, right, like if I'm curious what your sentiment is here, but like if I have to choose between a world where like we're trying stuff and some of it's wacky and like maybe it means we get to a sci-fi future and maybe we get more abundance versus like new apps and new iOS updates as like the measure of progress. Like I would rather take the riskier path towards like a sci-fi abundant spectacular future instead of just like live in the current state.
Yeah, well, I think that you sit there and say, okay, well, what does the future look like? You know, and exactly you hit the nail on the head, which is there are people, it feels like roughly half the country, maybe half the populace, who are skeptics and who say, well, just keep on keeping on, and everything else is bullshit, and everything I don't understand, I don't want to know about, and I think it's bullshit, whatever. And other people are like, okay, if we don't do something and we keep on running, we're running straight into a wall.
Yeah.
So we have to do something, so let's give it a shot, because doing nothing is, you know, so there's basically, you know, half the country saying, let's go, and then the other half of the country saying, you guys are all a bunch of wacky, crazy people. So to go back to you, how many tons of water have you been successful in like creating or dumping or whatever?
So the Utah program makes like hundreds of thousands of acre feet every year, which in terms of gallons is hundreds of millions of gallons every year. Yeah. Now that though historically was done with because there were companies before Rainmaker that did this. It was with statistical validation. So like it rained X% more here over the last 10 years where we were doing this program than the identical valley next to it. Now that we have radar there, we're trying to make the error bar smaller so we get that down to like a gallon measurement rather than an acre foot measurement.
Right.
So that's what the Utah program has looked like. Colorado's slightly smaller but similar scale. Then Santa Barbara and SLO are customers of ours as well. So like right up here. And
right here.
Then Orange County too, Santa Ana is another customer. So we just started with them this season, like November 1st.
And they hire you for what?
To make, so cloud seeding services to make more water.
Right.
Because their reservoirs aren't full, because their farmers need more water, because their streams are running low and that's endangering the fish there.
And it works. That is awesome. What are the common misconceptions and conspiracies you hear about cloud seeding?
Yeah.
Because cloud seeding and chemtrails get, there we go, get into it.
Yeah, they get mixed all the time. If you see streaks in the sky, right, like thin white cirrus cloud type streaks, not cloud seeding, not precipitation enhancement.
It's just...
That is largely, as far as I can tell, the condensation from planes.
Right.
Proving whether that's the case or not even relevant. But you
just said over Kansas City that the government, so why wouldn't they? So you're sort of, you have two arguments there.
Well, I'm saying that it wouldn't be out of the question that the government does something like that. The contrails that we do see, more likely than not, even though there are heavy metal additives in the fuel, are of relatively no consequence.
It's precipitation.
So the contrails they don't even precipitate. Those clouds, like where cloud
What are the
seeding
lines
happens,
that come out then?
That's condensation.
Condensation.
Yeah. Cloud seeding produces water. Chemtrails and contrails, nothing to do with it. Then the chemicals that are used, people will say, like barium or extremely carcinogenic substances. Like we use silver iodide, like I said, or dry ice even. Starting to experiment with that. Inconsequential environmentally and to people's health. So like we're not, per Alex Jones, like we're not doing anything to the frogs, say.
So if it's so safe and there's no problems, why does RFK hate it?
RFK hates McDonald's, and it's like
he was eating it the other day.
I know, I saw it. There was a "Hello Darkness, my old friend" edit of him eating that. And it's like.
But I mean, like silver iodide, like mercury, like there's a whole thing with
mercury's way worse.
Yeah, well, for sure. But it's bad.
Yeah.
So putting mercury into the environment is bad, and it's a carcinogen. So.
Yeah, but like what you emit from your car is bad, right? Like if you wear polyester clothes, that's bad for you. Like we make trades all the time, and so I think that if you have the choice between, millions more gallons of water or 8 parts per trillion more silver in said water, which is like almost immeasurable besides with the most sophisticated equipment from only 2 labs in the United States, way below the EPA guidelines for how much silver you should be exposed to, way below the WHO guidelines for how much you should be exposed to. Like that's a trade that I'm willing to make.
That's because you have a company that does it. But what about my question? Is there a finite amount of water?
Yeah.
Or can we make more on demand, if you will?
Yes and yes. So there is a finite amount of water in clouds and in the atmosphere, but clouds over the continental U.S. are generally only about 30% efficient when they precipitate. So most of the water in them doesn't even precipitate. And moreover, of all the water that traverses the atmosphere in the United States, so we're talking water vapor, liquid water, ice, only about 9% of it precipitates over the U.S. The rest is either recycled by the oceans or sublimates away, evaporates away. If we take just a sliver more of that finite water, then practically speaking, we have more that's net positive because it's landing in a place where we want it to rather than in the oceans. So can we produce more water for environmental, agricultural, and urban consumption? Yes.
Okay, so you're doing this every day, all day. You know more about the weather than, I'd say, 99% of the people out there. Is there a program to modify weather?
Is there a program to modify weather? At the state level, there's a bunch. So New Mexico has a pretty big one. Texas has like 4 different small county-wide ones. California has a bunch. Now, the feds used to have a ton. They used to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on this, but it fell away because of those attribution issues that I mentioned to you. Frank Lucas, the honorable member from Oklahoma, instigated a Government Accountability Office report into weather modification earlier this year. And so I think that what that means is, what obviously we want, is a federal program to be reinstantiated. Because China spends like $300 million a year. And so reaching at least parity with that and trying to outpace them is the plan. So is there a government program to modify weather?
Meaning you for your company, for example, you do state by state, county by county. But if there was a federal program, you could bid for tenders and say, hey, we want to do this federally.
Yeah, and it makes more sense to do it federally too. Again, like, sure, I'm pumping my own bags here, right? Self-interested party, have a company that does this. But it makes more sense for federal involvement because the watersheds are interstate, right? So like Colorado shouldn't be the sole payer for cloud seeding in Colorado. All the states in that basin should be included, like Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. They should all be included in a like multi-state federal program.
What's to stop the government from taking various technologies and saying, okay, well, now we're going to use these for our nefarious purposes?
Yeah. genuine problem and moral concern, right? And I think that, there's all the AI conversations happening now, right? Like, who's going to own the god that we're building in the computer? I don't know, like, the government has nuclear tech, the government has a bunch of other nefarious stuff. I guess it really just boils down to, as far as I'm concerned, like, to some extent, the American people can hold the American government accountable, like, to a very limited extent, but I still prefer that to China. That's the only limiting factor.
Yeah, China's going to do what it's going to do.
Yeah. In direct controversy to our interest.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And consciously so.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, Texas is the reason, as we say. Texas, why are you going to Texas?
Well, so earlier this year, Tennessee banned weather modification. And that inclined a bunch of other states to look into banning this. And there's a silly aspect of this, which is like, cloud seeding is such a small industry with potentially huge ramifications, but it hasn't been scaled before, so nobody reaps the benefits, really. So it's such an easy political win for like these freshman congressmen, like Republican freshman congressmen in state legislatures, to just be like, well, I'm going to ban Bill Gates from modifying the weather over your hometown. And so they're trying to ban weather modification in this upcoming session. North Dakota is now too. Funny thing about that, Doug Burgum, named the Trump pick for the new Secretary of the Interior. His state had one of the biggest and longest standing weather modification programs in the country. He, maybe because of that, will be more interested in it, but seems to be a little bit averse as well. But I think that, like, Texas, even though they are considering banning it, same as North Dakota, same as Kentucky, we're going back to Tennessee to try to flip it later this year. So there's a lot of flying around the country politicking, trying to get stuff not
Well, when you get back, let us know how it goes.
Okay.
India has no water.
Yep.
And they're damming the rivers, and it's a big issue for their development. The reason why I bring it up is China has been accused of cloud seeding on their side of the Himalayas during the monsoons, taking the water, and so there's a lot less water going into India, which really needs the water. So this brings me to cloud seeding, playing God, playing with weather, ramifications. Go.
So let's start with China, and then let's do the playing God.
Yeah.
China has said that by 2035, they want to have the best-in-class global weather modification technology available, right? Like, their Belt and Road stuff should be the leading indicator of what they're trying to do with all this other advanced tech. Reusable rockets, weather modification. India is rightfully concerned about people reducing precipitation on the other side of their border.
Yeah.
Like, the geopolitical consequences of who owns rain is going to have huge ramifications.
Yeah.
Like, for example, Ethiopia dammed the Nile. So now Sudan and Egypt are saber rattling with them. Like, if Sudan and Egypt can just produce more water, then they don't have to be as reliant on other countries and vice versa. So, like, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think the United States is perfect. I think that we flub up all the time as a government and nation. But if I had to choose between China or America stewarding this tech at a global scale, I would choose us.
Listen, we want to keep the channels open because you're an interesting cat, and we like talking to interesting cats. Very interesting. This, I think, is going to be an issue that grows in, I don't want to say popularity, but let's say controversy.
Oh, yeah.
And also, as things continue, obviously every year has become the hottest year on record. We keep on blowing out our worst case scenarios, climate-wise. And so, basically, I agree with you that if we don't try certain things, then we're in deep trouble. So very interesting. We want to keep talking to you about it. It was great to talk to you, and we want to talk to you again.
Thanks, Doug. Will do.
Now, this is another story that's going to drive everyone bazonkers and cause a lot of arguments. But this won't be the last time we talk about this topic, so please let us know in the comments what you think we missed or who you'd like us to talk to in a follow-up episode. Thank you, and good night.